Hey guys, welcome back. Today we are going to continue our lecture series on the Civil War, and specifically we are going to be taking a look at what was happening in the Trans-Mississippi Theater, in particular along the border between Missouri and Kansas. We saw them in our last unit turn quite violent in the days and months and years leading up into the Civil War itself. So, as I've always told my classes, the Civil War, I think growing up in Kansas City, in this area right there along the border, this is really the epicenter of that bleeding Kansas struggle. And we saw people from both sides attacking, and that will continue on throughout the war. There's going to be a lot of violence. If I will highlight it later on, but we'll talk about this painting behind me called Order Number 11 and the destruction of pretty much all residential homes in Jackson and Cass County and the surrounding areas. Really brutal stuff. In fact, one of the most brutal executive decisions ever made in wartime in the United States, and it took place right here at home. We'll also take a broader look at what's happening in the Trans-Mississippi Theater, really from start to finish, because we have not necessarily talked about them. So we're going to cover chronologically the Trans-Mississippi Theater today from 1861 all the way up through 1865. So with that being said, let's go ahead and jump into it. Let me get the screen pulled up here and we'll get started with our notes. All right. So introductory, we had, as I said, we had talked about the violence starting even before Fort Sumter. A couple interesting facts about this area of the country. Outside of Virginia and Tennessee, Missouri was home to the third most military clashes within its borders. Third, so Virginia, Tennessee, and then Missouri. So this was really a center of a lot of action in the Civil War. There were about 1,200 distinctive fights within Missouri at the time. The 1,200, full battles, skirmishes, what you will, but 1,200 distinct fights over that 4-year period. Even after Lee's surrender at Appomattox and Lincoln's assassination at Ford's Theater, Kansas and Missouri will continue to basically duke it out even after all the armies have gone home. So what did it mean to be a border state, and what effect did that have on Missouri? Missouri was designated as one of these border states at the beginning of the war. And what that meant was they were in a unique position, not only kind of dividing North and South, but also for Missouri, as we learned with the Missouri Compromise. Missouri is a slave state. Slavery was permitted within its borders. But one note that I would like you to make is that the vast majority of Missourians were not actually slave owners. In fact, slavery rarely existed outside of those counties that butted up against the Missouri River. If you look at the map on the right-hand side, you can see kind of what I'm talking about here. Now, of course, slavery did exist elsewhere, but the vast concentration of slaves in Missouri, as you can tell by the darker counties on that map on the right, all existed right there along the center as the Missouri River cut through the state. This, in fact, that area right there in the center would be known as Little Dixie, and we're going to talk about some major battles that took place there, including the Battle of Lexington, the Battle of Boonville, and so we'll get to that point eventually. So you had this weird setup in terms of Missouri demographics. Because early on, the early Missouri settlers were people looking to expand agriculturally. They were the ones that were, moving from, the old South and moving westward through Kentucky and trying to find farmland to create large plantations of various types. But by 1861, the demographics have really changed in Missouri, and you've had a wave of immigrants that have come into this country, including many German immigrants. Populations very high in St. Louis. Of course, Hermann, Missouri was originally an immigrant community that was set up. So, you have a large number of Irish and German immigrants that have come in, and frankly, they have remained loyal to the federal government. They will be pro-union for the most part throughout this war. So you have this weird dynamic because you have really those that are in positions of power, those that are in the government, and those that have kind of long-term wealth, the big, land owning citizens of Missouri. Many of them are pro-Southern. Many of them do have slaves, but the vast majority of normal people did not and were frankly pro-Union. This is going to partly explain why it's so confusing later on as to why, the South claims Missouri as a Confederate state, but yet the Union claims that Missouri is still a part of the Union. So 1861, by that point, the demographics had really changed. And I think that'll kind of set up our story later on. Let's go ahead and move on to talk about some of the important people and events of this this part of the story. The man pictured at the top is Claiborne Fox Jackson, and he was elected governor in 1860. He was a Douglas Democrat, and remember, we saw Stephen Douglas representing the Northern Democrats. He was one that favored compromise in regards to these issues that were dividing the nation, but soon after his election, he did begin promoting Missouri's secession. He wanted Missouri to leave the Union for the South. Now, he took some action early on that caused some ripple effects and caused a lot of concern out of Washington, D.C. Moving down to the Camp Jackson affair. This was a week before Fort Sumter. And what you had was Governor Jackson basically there was a pro-Confederate forces that were excuse me, I apologize, back up here. A week before Fort Sumter, there had been a federal arsenal in Liberty, Missouri that had been raided, and there were about 1,000 rifles that had been taken by pro-Southerners, pro-Confederates. There's a growing fear among leadership in Washington, D.C., that attacks on other arsenals are very likely in Missouri, and in particular, the one in St. Louis. Now, St. Louis Arsenal was by far one of the biggest arsenals that the Union had throughout the entire country. There were approximately 40,000 rifles stockpiled in St. Louis, and frankly, it was the largest stockpile of Union weapons in any slavery state in the entire Union. So basically, there had to be moves to get those weapons out of there before any pro-Confederate groups could take that over. So Washington, D.C. is going to send a young general named Nathaniel Lyon. He is for the Union Army. He is sent by the War Department to enlist volunteers in St. Louis. Almost 80% of Unionists that signed up with Lyon were Germans. So once again, bringing in that demographic difference from earlier in Missouri history, 80% were German immigrants that had recently moved into the St. Louis area. Lyon understands that there's a growing threat, and that is this threat from what is called Camp Jackson. Meanwhile, as Lyon is raising an army in St. Louis, Governor Jackson had made a secret plan to take the arsenal. Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, he would ultimately send supplies, artillery, rifles to actually supply Jackson's men. The plan was to take this arsenal in St. Louis, but before they actually took action, they decided to basically set up camp, and this becomes known as Camp Jackson. It was about 4.5 miles away from the arsenal, and the governor told the Union forces that they were only setting up there to hold training for any basically militia exercises. Obviously, General Lyon did not believe this line at all. In fact, one of the interesting stories behind this is that Lyon himself, suspecting that it was a plot, he actually dressed up like an elderly woman. He put on a long dress, and I'm not sure how he covered the beard, but either way, he actually dressed up as an old woman and walked through Camp Jackson. And of course, as he was inspecting the camp, he realized that his concerns were legitimate. And so he basically exposed the camp, and he led 6,000 Missouri volunteers to actually put the camp down. They ended up arresting just under 700 men who refused to take an oath of allegiance. That's all they were asking, was that these men would take an oath of allegiance to the United States. They refused to do that. 669 pro-Jackson, pro-Southern men were arrested after refusing to take that oath. And one interesting and sad thing, and you can see the picture down here at the bottom, this actually did turn violent, because as they began to march those men through the city who had been arrested for failing to take the oath of allegiance, angry secessionists are actually going to begin throwing rocks and eventually firing into Union soldiers, who, of course, return fire themselves. 28 people will end up dying as a result of this Camp Jackson affair. Violence will continue in St. Louis for several days until General Lyon will declare martial law, which gives the military the authority to make all decisions regarding, civil and property rights and whatnot. He declared martial law in St. Louis, and they waited for the federal regulars to arrive. So, what's interesting, what's important about this is that, Lyon was able to, first of all, get those weapons out of St. Louis. If I did not mention that, after he basically realized that this was a plot to take the arsenal, Lyon had 21,000 rifles shipped across the river into Illinois to keep them out of the hands of the Confederates or the Missouri state government. But the importance here is that this is the first introduction of the Union forces in Missouri. And Missouri would basically be controlled by Union forces for most of the war. There will be moments where the South has a major victory, but ultimately the Union forces are here. And for the Missouri government, they're kind of a government on the run. So we'll talk about them here in a minute. The Missouri State Guard. After the Camp Jackson affair, Jackson proposed a military bill that basically did everything but secede in name. The bill created the Missouri State Guard, and it named Major General Sterling Price as a commander of that guard. After the bill was created, Nathaniel Lyon, Union general, met privately with Governor Jackson, and they ended up holding a 4-hour meeting just between the two men. And we don't know exactly what happened in that meeting. So you have, the governor, the pro-Southern governor on one side of the table, and on the other side of the table, you have the Union general that has declared martial law in St. Louis. We don't know what exactly was said. The meeting lasted 4 hours, and it ended as Nathaniel Lyon, the Union general, left the room and basically was shouting, "This means war." And this is a direct quote from witnesses. "This means war. In an hour, one of my officers will call on you and conduct you out of my lines." Basically saying, "Hey, Governor, you got 1 hour, and my guys are coming to arrest you." So, Lyon was not going to take this from the Missouri governor. I mean, again, bringing the state to the brink of secession here. The government basically had to flee. Jackson will return to Jefferson City in the center of the state, and Lyon's men are going to follow him. They are going to arrest the governor. Jackson decided at first to flee to Boonville. Boonville was just west of Jefferson City, and so what this meant was Nathaniel Lyon was able to take Jefferson City and would, for the most part, hold Jefferson City for the remainder of the war. And it was at Boonville that Governor Jackson's going to kind of make his first stand here. And Jackson's men will try to hold their ground, but ultimately they are routed by the well-trained and well-supplied men of Lyon's forces. After the battle, Jackson and his men would flee south. They would go south of the Arkansas border, effectively leaving all of Missouri under federal control. Now, this did not necessarily mean that that Missouri had been fully settled by the Union Army, that they had been fully occupying the area. In fact, there was a constitutional convention that was called. And I want to remind you that we talked about this in our government unit. We talked about how a new Constitution has been created multiple times throughout our state's history, and it requires that the General Assembly, the legislature, come together and they agree, have to have, I believe, 3/4 votes to confirm that, to ratify anything. So here's what ends up happening. So basically you have a government on the run at this time, and you had a number of state delegates meet in the city of Neosho. And they basically said that the state excuse me, that the office of governor, I'm sorry, I think I've gotten, I skipped down in my notes a little bit. Let me go back up. So basically, there's a constitutional convention held first in Jefferson City, and this is under kind of Union control. We'll talk about another one that takes place down in Neosho. Sorry, I'm confusing the issues here. This constitutional convention does take place in Jefferson City because once the government left, they're going to be operating in exile. Their pro-union government is basically installed, and in fact, it is recognized by Lincoln at this time. So, Jefferson City will remain under Union control, and there will be a Missouri government operating during this time, whereas the elected government is kind of on the run, and that's when we get down to Neosho. When they meet down at Neosho, which is in a very southwest corner of Missouri, they decide to set up a government in exile, and they officially then vote to secede from the Union and to join the Confederacy. But there's a problem with this. Even though they are the elected officials, they do not have quorum. Okay, the word quorum means a simple majority. Okay, they did not have more than half of the delegates needed to make this decision, and so you have kind of this in limbo, right? You have one side saying that the Confederacy is going to say that Missouri has voted to secede, that they are part of us. The Union says, listen, that's not a legitimate decision. That was not made with quorum. And so they say that, listen, the legitimate government after the capital has been abandoned is in Jefferson City. And so they will point to that. So both sides claim Missouri as their own. Let's talk about one of the first major battles of really the entire war. And this takes place down just outside of Springfield, Missouri. It is known as the Battle of Wilson's Creek. And again, we're jumping backwards chronologically from our other lectures. This is at the very beginning of the war, August 1861. This is a pretty major battle. You can see the Confederates vastly outnumbered the Union. 12,000 to 5,400. We have the commanders that we've already discussed, Lyon representing the Union, Sterling Price representing the Confederacy. One interesting note about this is that during the fighting, Nathaniel Lyon would be shot and killed. He will be replaced. The Union Army will replace their leader here, and they will be led by John C. Fremont. We've talked about Fremont before, explorer. He was very active in the Mexican-American War preceding that, and in California, trying to get that to secede. So we've seen Fremont multiple times. He had been a presidential candidate, I think in 1856, maybe, for the Republican side. So either way, we see that Lyon is killed, and that is of importance because he would be the first Union general killed in the entire war. The entire war. This is where the first Union general died. The Confederates, though, do carry the field that day, but they run into a problem, and that is they disagree on what to do after the battle. They disagree with the strategy after the battle. Sterling Price wants to go north. He wants to invade Missouri, but the majority of Confederate forces, they decide they really doubt their ability to beat an even larger federal force. Lyon's men had kind of been spread out, having to control various areas. So they said, listen, if we keep in pushing this and we encounter a larger army like we did at Boonville, we're probably not going to win. Price does ultimately lead the Missouri State Guard into Missouri in an attempt to retake the state. Fremont will be put in command, as I said, and he will remain the leader of the Union forces for quite a while. The next major battle I want you guys to know, one of my favorites here, is the Battle of Lexington. And Lexington was a very important city during this period. In fact, if you go there today, you walk through the small graveyard, you will find numerous Missouri governors, and including some of some of the wealthiest citizens of Missouri at this time, all lived in Lexington. So it was a very important city right along the Missouri River. It was especially important for the crop of hemp. This will be known as the Battle of the Hemp Bales. We'll talk about why that is later on. So a month after the Battle of Wilson's Creek, you have the Battle of Lexington. The victory, I guess I should mention about the hemp bales. Okay, hemp is one of those words that inspires a lot of different thoughts in people. The hemp was actually the #1 agricultural product of Missouri in the pre-war days. In fact, up until the 1930s, it was the #1 crop in Missouri. Hemp has a lot of uses that it gets wrapped up, of course, in the new drug laws of the 1930s and renewed in the 1970s. So, the last, 2/3 of the 20th century, we saw hemp production decimated in Missouri, but it had been the #1 product. They would make everything from, textiles, clothing, to sails, to ropes. Everything was made out of hemp. It's a very durable product. And so Lexington was at the center of that. They had a lot of hemp production. And that's going to play into how the battle actually gets fought. So let's talk about some of the details behind this. Missouri State Guard show up. They got 15,000 men. The Union are vastly outnumbered, almost 5 to 1. And they only have 3,500 guys. Now, I usually don't get too detailed about battles, but I think this one's pretty interesting to kind of break down. The Anderson House, a few months before the battle had begun, one of the most prominent homes in Lexington had been taken by Union forces, and it had been turned into a Union hospital. Okay, so at the time the battle begins, this was a functioning Union hospital. Well, due to its location and its strategic importance, and if you can follow my cursor down here, you can see Anderson's house, very close to the river. I've been there. You can almost see the river from the house. I'm sure on a clear day you probably can, but yeah, the Anderson's house was used as a hospital, and there are rules of war that govern, what can be done with field hospitals. And so basically the Union had controlled it, but the Confederates would end up taking control of the house when the battle began. The most controversial moment of this battle comes when later in the day, when the Federal forces once again take over the Union house that had been raided by Confederates, and basically claiming that these Confederates had broken the rules of war. They ended up basically trying and executing them on the front porch. There were, I think, there were, let me double check my numbers. There were 3 Missouri State Guard soldiers that were executed on the front steps of the Anderson house for violating the laws of war about taking hospitals over in the first place. Obviously, this was this is the kind of example I'm always talking about when I mention, war is tragic. War is always tragic. And, there are 1,000 little stories like this where you have, kind of gray areas of legality and, should these men have been executed on the spot? Ultimately somebody's father, somebody's son, the Union felt as if they were in the right, that they were upholding those rules of war. But just overall, just tragic events that are happening. And it leads to such bitter, after effects as well. Well, moving down to the courthouse, Sterling Price had set up his headquarters in a local bank across from the courthouse, which served as the county seat. It's where the trials were held and all that. So basically, Price has his headquarters set up. And the reason we mention the courthouse is that famously, it actually gets struck by a cannonball from where the fighting was happening. It gets struck by a cannonball that gets lodged in the courthouse columns. And you can actually see that cannonball there in the picture I have in the upper right-hand corner. Now, not to ruin part of the story, I do know at one point it was taken out or fell out. They have since basically bolted that in, but that is where it struck. That is an actual Civil War cannonball that you can actually see today from the street. An interesting piece of history there. The Missouri State Guard began placing hemp bales in a line to form protection from Union fire. They soaked these hemp bales in water from the Missouri River, knowing that, the hot lead pouring into them, if they were getting shot at, that could actually spark them on fire. And so they soaked them in water first, in the mud of the Missouri River. And what they slowly basically did, they kind of created kind of trench lines, and they began to roll these hemp bales at the Union forces, allowing them to get close enough to the Union lines for kind of a final rush. And they forced the Union Army to surrender. They already had 5 times the amount of guys, but still, it was kind of one of those amazing visuals. You know, you see the Confederates, you know, on their knees pushing these hemp bales, inching closer and closer towards the Union lines, and ultimately overtaking them. Now, due to the defensive positions the fighting was taking place from, the casualty rate for this battle was actually quite low. Price would suffer approximately 100 casualties. The Federals only about 150. The Federal forces who surrendered, they were basically forced to listen to a speech by Governor Jackson, who kind of berated them for invading his state unlawfully. And at that time, what happened was honestly a fairly common practice on the battlefield at that time. You know, this is still, you know, a time of pride and respect. And this is one thing that they would often do. You know, the Confederate Army is not in a position to take on prisoners of war, at least in this scenario. And so one thing that they would often do is basically force these soldiers that had been captured to take a loyalty oath, or at least a pledge. They had to basically say an oath that they promised to give up fighting. And they do allow them to be what's called paroled. So the federal forces that are captured here are paroled. They're sent out. They basically promise not to fight again. And you might be wondering, because I get this question every year, well, what stopped them from fighting again? And the answer is really nothing. In fact, some of these men who are captured here were actually caught later on, and records of their names had been kept. Some of them are actually caught at the Battle of Shiloh that we have already discussed, and some of them will actually be executed for violating that oath. So, well, what stopped these paroled soldiers from going right back to it? Nothing officially, but ultimately records were kept, and if they were found to be violating that parole, they were often executed on the spot. Now, there will be another Battle of Lexington later on in the war, but it is frankly much less influential and or memorable. Let's talk about one closer to home, and that is the Battle of Lone Jack in August of 1862. By mid-1862, the city of Independence has fallen to a combined Confederate force made up of both regular soldiers and guerrilla soldiers. One of those guerrilla soldiers is a man named William Quantrell. Now, Quantrell is going to be one of these major figures moving forward, very active in that border war. He was one that's ultimately we're going to see going over burning Lawrence. We talked about the burning of Lawrence. But he will lead a group of raiders, including a young man named Cole Younger that we will talk about from Lee Summit, born and raised, buried in Lee Summit Cemetery. And he would actually, after the war, Younger would become famous for robbing banks with Jesse James, part of the James Younger gang. So, you got a lot of famous characters that are right here in this Battle of Lone Jack. But the situation, once again, is that Price has basically become a major general in the Confederate Army and has been ordered to retake parts of Jackson County. The battle itself actually kind of started by mistake. The Union attacked these Confederate forces, believing that they had numerical superiority. Unbeknownst to the Union, though, there had been another camp of Confederates close by that actually heard the artillery blasts and came, alerted them to the battle. The battle would see these artillery cannons kind of as the center point of the battle, as the most important pieces. In fact, they would change hands a couple times in the battle. The Union refused to back down, primarily due to the fear that those Confederates that they were actually fighting were made up of Quantrell's, they called them the Black Flag Raiders. These men did not obey the rules of war. They were known not to give quarter to surrendering troops. So these Union soldiers are terrified. William Quantrell's on the other side of this line, and if they capture us, we're dead. Like they are fighting for their very life. Well, the outnumbered and fearful, the Union forces really did take a lot of casualties before losing ground to the rebel soldiers. Before I finish with the Battle of Lone Jack, I did want to mention, as I said, Cole Younger there. He's 18 years old at this battle. He actually served as a runner, supplying troops at the front lines with ammunition. And like I said, he would become famous later on in life after the war for robbing banks with Jesse James. In fact, another fun fact, I guess, about the Battle of Lone Jack, one of my favorite Westerns, John Wayne Western, True Grit. He's this rough and tumble cowboy. In fact, he's lost an eye. And somebody asks him in the movie, where'd you lose that eye? And he said, the Battle of Lone Jack, a small scrap outside Kansas City. So there's kind of the last claim to fame there. All right, we are going to pause right here because we got a couple of major issues that are going to be coming up. So this has been part one of the Missouri-Kansas, the war in Missouri and Kansas, and we'll pick right back up here in a second with the guerrilla fighting that's happening, and we'll see what ends up happening with Price's raid and ultimately the surrender of Missouri. All right, as always, please email me if you have any questions or concerns.